January 26, 1950, 10,000 feet above the Canadian Yukon. You're the radio operator aboard a Douglas C-54 Skymaster, and the routine flight from Anchorage to Great Falls is going exactly as planned. 44 souls on board, including a pregnant woman traveling with her 19-month-old son. Her husband's final words at the airport echo in your mind. If you have to jump, give the baby to Sergeant Roy Jones. The unpressurized cabin keeps you low, threading between towering peaks that reach 7,000 feet. Outside the small windows, an endless expanse of white wilderness stretches to every horizon. 2 hours in, you check in near Snag, Yukon. Low visibility, ice on the wings, turbulence. But it's nothing unusual for January flying in the north. You're scheduled to report in again in 30 minutes just outside Eshiak. But as you reach for the radio transmitter, something goes wrong. The mountains below seem to rise up to meet you, and the white void outside grows larger until it all fades to black. Your next transmission never comes. The aircraft simply vanishes into the vast Canadian wilderness, taking 44 people with it. Because in the North Country's unforgiving landscapes, where temperatures oftentimes drop to 40 below and daylight disappears for months, some flights never reach their destination. They just disappear into the white silence, leaving behind only questions that echo through 75 years of searching. This is Northern Crimes. On January 26, 1950, a Douglas C-54 Skymaster carrying 44 people vanished into the icy wilderness of the Canadian Yukon, becoming one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. The aircraft, serial number 42-72469, was flying what should have been a routine 8-hour journey from Anchorage, Alaska to Great Falls, Montana. Instead, it disappeared without a trace, sparking one of the most intriguing search operations in North American history. The Skymaster was part of the 1st Strategic Support Squadron, carrying 8 crew members led by First Lieutenant Kyle McMichael. Among the 36 passengers were servicemen returning to the lower 48 states, a pregnant woman named Joyce Espy traveling with her 19-month-old son Victor, and Sergeant Roy Jones. He'd promised to help care for the child if anything went wrong. In fact, Joyce's husband, Master Sergeant Robert Espy, had spoken his final words to his wife at the airport. "If you have to jump, give the baby to Sergeant Roy Jones." Those words would haunt him for the rest of his life. The flight began normally, following the well-established northwest staging route, literally a highway through the sky that had carried thousands of aircraft during World War II. At 10,000 feet, the unpressurized cabin limited their altitude options as they navigated through towering peaks that reached sometimes over 7,000 feet tall. 2 hours into the flight, the Skymaster checked in by radio near Snag, Yukon. The crew reported they were on schedule but experiencing low visibility, wing icing, and some turbulence. This was nothing particularly unusual for January flying conditions in the north. They were expected to check in again 30 minutes later at Eshiak, but the call never came. When the aircraft failed to report, both American and Canadian forces mobilized immediately. Operation Mike, named after Flight Commander McMichael, became a massive joint effort involving over 85 aircraft, 7,000 personnel, and searches covering 350,000 square miles of wilderness terrain. Adding to the tragedy, the search itself became deadly. 4 aircraft crashed during the operation, though miraculously, all crew members survived these incidents. The crashes underscored the terrifying flying conditions that may have claimed the Skymaster. As the search continued, reports flooded in from across the territory. An indigenous trapper named Albert Isaac reported hearing, quote, a sound like thunder, possibly an avalanche near Gladstone Creek. He also spotted carrion birds above the area. Despite investigating Albert's report, searchers found nothing. The investigation was also complicated by Operation Sweetbriar, a massive joint Canada-US war game involving 5,200 troops that was simultaneously taking place in the same region. Smoke and flares from the military exercise generated false leads, diverting resources from the actual search. Then, on February 13th, disaster struck elsewhere. A B-36 bomber carrying an atomic bomb experienced engine failure, and the crew was forced to jettison and detonate the weapon over the Pacific Ocean. The quote, broken arrow incident immediately diverted search resources away from the Skymaster, and Operation Mike was suspended on February 20th. The official accident report recommended resuming the search after spring thaw, but it never happened. The U.S. Air Force moved on, and the 44 people on board were simply forgotten by official channels. But for Robert Espy, the search never ended. He dedicated a room in his home to his lost family, filled with maps and radio equipment, spending his life savings trying to find them. He died of a heart attack in 1968, never knowing what happened to Joyce and Victor. Today, 75 years later, the Skymaster remains missing. Despite modern technology, DNA analysis, and renewed volunteer efforts, the 44 people on board are still out there somewhere in the foreboding Canadian wilderness, waiting to be found. Christmas Day, 1971 in Anchorage, Alaska, broke at a balmy 40 degrees above zero, a welcome relief from the Arctic cold front that had gripped the city only days before. Two brothers, John and James Corpy, decided to venture south along the Seward Highway to capture photos of the fjord-like mountains above Turnagain Arm. What they discovered at McHugh Creek would shatter the holiday peace and launch one of Alaska's most controversial unsolved murder cases. John Corpy was positioning his camera on a steep overlook, struggling to focus while maintaining his balance on the awkward perch. Behind a bush no more than 10 feet away, he spotted what looked like a mannequin dropped at an odd angle and partially covered with snow. Craning his neck forward for a better look, the horrifying reality hit him. It was a body, a young woman, nude from the waist down, with a soft cover of downy snowflakes across her exposed thighs. The victim was 18-year-old Celia Beth Van Zanten, who'd vanished on December 23rd while on her way to a local convenience store. When Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Walter Gilmore arrived at the crime scene, he found evidence of a brutal struggle. Beth's wrists were tied behind her back with speaker wire. She'd been sexually assaulted and her chest slashed with a knife. The evidence told a harrowing story of survival and desperation. Beth had somehow managed to escape her attacker and literally ran for her life through 3 feet of snow on a rugged slope. Her first fall was 50 feet from the presumed location of the murderer's car. With her hands bound behind her, it would have taken superhuman effort to regain her feet and continue the descent. She made it within 10 to 15 feet of the McHugh Creek waterfall before turning away at the last minute. In the days since she'd gone missing, temperatures had ranged from -5 to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Beth had literally frozen to death. The investigation quickly identified several suspects, but the case would become entangled with one of Alaska's most notorious serial killers. Just 4 days before Beth's disappearance, an Anchorage teenager had been kidnapped at gunpoint by a man who drove her south on the same Seward Highway. The attacker bound her hands with leather shoelaces, threatened to slash her bra with his knife, and made her strip to prevent escape, chilling similarities to Beth's case. The teenager identified her attacker from police photos as Robert Hansen, a local baker who would later become known as, quote, the Butcher Baker. Hansen was already facing charges for the attempted kidnapping of a real estate secretary just a month earlier. When confronted about Beth's murder during his 1984 confession to killing 17 women, Hansen blurted out, "That Van Zanten case? Nah, I didn't have nothing to do with that." But Hansen wasn't the only suspect. The investigation also focused on Gary Zeiger, a stone-cold psychopath who'd already murdered a young Alaska Native boy in 1971. Zeiger would go on to kill multiple people before being gunned down in 1973. Some investigators believed that he was responsible for Beth's death. The third suspect was Beth's foster cousin Greg, who lived in the same house and had allegedly asked her to babysit on the night she disappeared. However, witnesses placed him downtown drinking with friends, and Sergeant Gilmore never found another reason to suspect him in subsequent years. Despite extensive investigations, no one was ever charged with Beth's murder. The case remains officially unsolved, though many believe Robert Hansen was responsible. The similarities between Beth's assault and Hansen's confirmed crimes, the location, the binding, the sexual assault, the slashed clothing, it all paints a disturbing pattern. On the evening of September 4th, 1978, 2 children vanished from their family cabin in Sterling, Alaska, sparking a mystery that lingers to this day. 13-year-old Scott Fandel and his 8-year-old sister Amy disappeared sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. on September 5th, leaving behind no trace and a family desperate for answers that would never come. The Fandel children lived with their mother Margaret in a small 2-room cabin in the woods near Sterling. Now, for reference, Sterling is a very small, somewhat rural town about 130 miles south of Anchorage and 15 miles north of Soldotna. Today, it has a population of around 6,500 that's spread out over many miles, with houses and businesses along the roadside and cabins and homes dotted throughout the forest. But back in 1978, the population was under 1,000, an even smaller and much more remote place than today. Their father, Roger, had left the family earlier that year after a turbulent marriage, moving to Arizona and leaving Margaret to raise the kids alone. She worked long hours as a waitress to pay the bills, and the kids were often unsupervised in their remote woodland home. That fateful evening began ordinarily enough. Margaret and the children, along with Margaret's visiting sister Kathy, spent time at Good Time Charlie's, a local bar and restaurant south of Sterling. And just to note, more recently, Good Time Charlie's has also been a seedy strip club, but I digress. Around 10 p.m., the women dropped Scott and Amy back at the cabin before returning to the bar for several more hours of drinking. The children didn't stay home. Instead, they walked to their neighbors, the Luptons, who lived a short distance away. The Lupton family had 5 children of their own, and Scott and Amy were frequent visitors who walked to the school bus stop with the Lupton kids each morning. The children played together until around 11:45 p.m., when the Luptons decided that it was time for everyone to settle down for the night. They sent Scott and Amy back to their cabin. This was the last confirmed sighting of the Fandel children alive. Between 2 and 3 a.m., Margaret and Kathy returned from the bar to find something unsettling. On the stove sat a pot of boiling water with a package of macaroni nearby. Scott was known for making late-night pasta snacks, but strangely, all the lights in the cabin were turned off. Scott and Amy were afraid of the dark. Typically, they left all the lights on when they were home alone. Now, there's debate about whether the women really checked in on the children that night. Some sources have said they didn't, while others claim they did. Either way, they eventually got home and went to sleep, perhaps assuming the children were spending the night at the Luptons' house. The next morning, Margaret left for work around 8:30 a.m., looking around for the children but assuming they'd already left for school. When she called the school later that day and learned Amy had never arrived, concern began to mount. But her boss wouldn't let her leave work, so she remained anxious but trapped at her job. Around noon, Kathy woke up to find the children still missing. When the Leptons came by after school looking for Scott and Amy, the horrible reality set in. No one knew where they were. Margaret was contacted immediately, and the police were called to report the children missing. Despite extensive searches involving hundreds of volunteers, search dogs, and law enforcement, no trace of Scott and Amy was ever found. The investigation explored numerous theories: stranger abduction, family involvement, even the possibility that a wild animal had frightened them from the cabin. Suspicion initially fell on various family members. Robert blamed his uncle, Herman Fandel, while Herman pointed fingers back at Roger. Investigators even went so far as to dig up Herman's yard searching for the kids' bodies, but found nothing. Margaret's phone was tapped to listen for incriminating statements, but this too led nowhere. The case has remained cold for over 4 decades now. Scott would be 59 years old today, Amy 54. Their disappearance represents one of Alaska's oldest unsolved child abduction cases, a mystery that has baffled investigators and haunted the small community of Sterling for generations. What happened to Scott and Amy Fandel on that September night in 1978? The answer remains buried somewhere on the Kenai Peninsula, waiting for someone to finally break their silence. On a blustery October night in 1985, 25-year-old Doug Cleaves was settling in for a quiet evening at his Sand Lake duplex in Anchorage, Alaska. Just weeks out of the hospital after losing both legs in a horrific electrical accident, Doug was finally putting his life back together. He'd won custody of his nearly 2-year-old son Robert, and despite his disability, he was optimistic about the future. But that optimism would be shattered by 2 loud knocks on his door just after midnight. Doug Cleaves was a mountain of a man before his accident, 6'4", around 250 pounds, with an infectious personality that could charm anyone. Born in New Jersey, he'd achieved 2 childhood dreams by age 20, joining the Army and moving to Alaska. After serving as an artilleryman and paratrooper, he stayed in the North Country, working various jobs from bouncing at nightclubs to driving trucks. His life took a dramatic turn during a bitter custody battle with his ex-wife, Charlotte Palmer. After more than a year of legal warfare, Superior Court Judge Beverly Cutler awarded Doug primary custody of his son in July 1985. Charlotte's visitation was severely limited, and she immediately filed appeals. Doug, on the other hand, was ecstatic. His friends said he talked about nothing but his son and their future together. But 3 weeks after winning custody, tragedy struck. On July 18, 1985, while working construction at a pizza restaurant site in Eagle River, Doug was unloading steel when a crane's boom hit a power line. 115,000 volts of electricity surged through his body, literally exploding his feet. Doug spent 2 months at Providence Hospital, where nurses marveled at his determination. Despite losing both legs below the knees, he refused to let his disability define him. On the night of October 19, 1985, Doug was relaxing with his sister and 2 female friends watching the movie Fame after enjoying dinner. Robert was with his mother for the weekend. Just after midnight, 2 sharp raps echoed from the front door. Susan answered and froze. A hooded figure stood on the front porch, face covered by a balaclava, except for the eyes and mouth. He wore a trench coat and combat boots, gripping a large caliber rifle. She tried slamming the door, but the intruder wedged the rifle barrel into the door jamb and burst in. Doug, sitting helpless on the floor without the use of his legs, raised his hands and pleaded, "Hey, don't shoot. I understand what's going on. Don't shoot. We can work this out." These would be his final words. The killer fired 5 shots, 3 to the head, 2 to the chest, and then calmly walked out into the night. The investigation that followed became one of Anchorage's most intensive manhunts. Ken Spadafora, who later became deputy chief of the Anchorage Police Department, or APD, led the case. The execution-style killing in front of 3 witnesses suggested this wasn't a random crime. Someone wanted Doug dead, badly enough to commit murder in front of multiple people. Theories abounded about the motive. Some speculated it was connected to drugs, though Doug's family vehemently rejected this, pointing out he was a devoted dad who'd just won a custody battle. Others believed that the substantial settlement Doug was expecting from his workplace accident made him a target. But the most persistent theory centered on the custody dispute. With Doug dead, custody would default to Charlotte, along with any settlement money that would go to Robert. Doug's mother, Ruth, sold property to offer a $25,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, but no credible leads ever emerged. The case grew cold despite the extensive evidence and witness testimony. Whoever killed Doug Cleves had planned the execution carefully and vanished without a trace. Today, nearly 4 decades later, Doug's murder remains unsolved. His son Robert is now in his 40s. He grew up without ever knowing his dad, and as time slips away, one is left to wonder if this case will ever be solved. In the remote wilderness of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula lies one of America's most haunting ghost towns. Portlock, also known as Port Chatham, was once a thriving fishing community of Russian Aleutic settlers who built their lives around a successful salmon cannery. By 1950, every single resident had fled in terror, abandoning their homes, their school, and their livelihoods to escape something they called Nantinaq, a creature so fearsome that an entire village chose exile over facing it. The story begins in the early 1900s when Russian Aleutic families established a settlement in the sheltered bay that Captain Nathaniel Portlock had discovered in 1785. The location was perfect. Calm waters protected from Alaska's brutal storms, abundant salmon runs, and rich natural resources. By 1921, the community was prosperous enough to establish a post office, and families built a school for their children. But the indigenous Supkiak people had long avoided this area, and their oral traditions spoke of Nantinaq, literally meaning half man, half beast. According to their legends, these creatures were once human but had transformed into something monstrous, growing hair all over their bodies and developing supernatural strength. The Supkiak believed that Nantinaq could shapeshift into different animals and were nearly impossible to kill. The first documented trouble began in the 1920s when Sergius Moonin and his girlfriend reported hearing loud whistling in the woods, followed by sightings of a large, hairy bipedal creature walking along the beach. But it was in 1931 that the terror truly began. Andrew Kamluck, a logger working in the forest, was found dead with his head crushed by an extremely heavy piece of logging equipment. The machinery was far too heavy for one person to wield as a weapon, and it was found several feet away from his body. Local residents whispered that only something with superhuman strength could have committed such a brutal act. Over the next 2 decades, the disappearances and deaths mounted. Gold prospectors ventured into the mountains and never returned. Hunters tracking dull sheep and bears would vanish without a trace. When bodies were occasionally found, they were mutilated in ways that bears simply couldn't accomplish, torn and dismembered with a savagery that defied explanation. Witnesses reported finding enormous human-like footprints, over 18 inches long, following the tracks of moose through soft ground. The signs would show evidence of a brief struggle where the grass had been matted down. Then, only the deeper tracks of the creature departing toward the fog-shrouded mountains, apparently carrying its prey. The psychological toll on the community was devastating. Residents lived in constant fear, especially during foggy weather when visibility was limited. Parents kept their children close, and no one ventured out alone after dark. The cannery workers became so terrified that they demanded armed guards be posted to protect them. By the late 1940s, the situation had become unbearable. Families who'd built their lives in Portlock for decades made the agonizing decision to abandon everything. In 1949, the Great Exodus began. Residents packed only what they could carry and fled to neighboring communities like Port Graham and Nanwalek, leaving behind their homes, their furniture, their dreams. The post office was closed in 1950, and Portlock became a ghost town virtually overnight. Even today, 75 years later, many Alaska natives from the region refuse to spend the night in the abandoned village. They speak of an oppressive feeling of being watched and an overwhelming sense of dread that permeates the area. Modern investigators have explored various theories, from serial killers to wild animals to mass hysteria, but the fact remains that an entire community abandoned a prosperous settlement not for economic reasons, but out of sheer terror. Today, Portlock stands as a testament to the power of fear and the enduring mysteries of Alaska's vast wilderness. Alaska's vast wilderness continues to hold numerous unsolved mysteries. These cases span decades and share common elements: minimal physical evidence, challenging terrain, and harsh climate conditions that complicate investigations. But despite the passage of time, in some cases over 70 years, these mysteries remain open, and